The inner garment worn in those days was a tunic, called in Hebrew a ketonet, like the one I'm wearing here today. It was usually made of 2 square pieces of cloth stitched together, leaving holes for the head and for the arms. How do we know that? Tunics from the time of Jesus have been discovered in the desert in Israel in caves near the Dead Sea. Tunics were everyday clothing. They wore them when they were working, they wore them when they were sleeping. But as the ladies know, it's sometimes a little difficult to work in a skirt, so you had to make some adjustment to be able to work in a tunic. This adjustment is called girding up your loins. Have you ever wondered what this meant? Well, I'll show you. You just take a hold of the bottom of the garment, and then you bring it up and tuck it into the belt. Now you're ready to run or to fight or to work in the fields. And at night, after you're finished with all those things, you just release it and you're ready for sleep. Jesus told his disciples that one tunic was all they needed to get started in ministry. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 10, he said, "Don't get 2 tunics." I guess one was enough. Jesus' own tunic was made of 1 piece, which made it more valuable. That's why at the crucifixion, the soldiers cast lots for it. The tunic was held together with a belt. This was made of either cloth or leather, like the belt of John the Baptist. Though for John's leather belt to get special attention meant it was probably somewhat unusual. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 9, Jesus gave his disciples some strange instructions about their belts. He said, "Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your belts." Well, what did he mean by this? Let's say I was going to the market to buy something and I wanted to take along some money, like these coins from the time of Jesus, discovered in Israel. Well, where would I put them? A tunic has no pockets. Well, I just find a place in my belt and put them there. Then when I arrived at the market, I could take them out and I could spend them. Even today, Muslims who go to Mecca on the Hajj use their belts to keep their money. The sandals they wore were essentially identical to those that were popular in the 1960s. Unlike the ones that I'm wearing now, the straps were very narrow and sometimes were tied around the back of the foot. How do we know they were wearing sandals like that in Jesus' day? Because sandals from that time were also discovered in caves near the Dead Sea. In Mark chapter 1, verse 7, John the Baptist said he was not worthy to untie Jesus' sandals. "One more powerful than I is coming after me, of whom I am not worthy to bend down and untie the tongue of his sandals." Well, what does this really mean? Carrying the sandals and washing the feet of a teacher was the sign that you wanted to become his disciple. John, by saying that he's not worthy to do this, is saying that he's not worthy to be a disciple of the Messiah. Well, Jesus turned this tradition upside down when he washed the feet of his disciples. No wonder they were so surprised. Do you remember Peter said to him, "You will certainly not ever wash my feet." Well, it was a shocking action. But Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Doing a surprising action was a teaching technique of the rabbis in those days. It got the attention of his disciples, which is just what he wanted, so they would never forget his teaching. And it worked. Here we are talking about it 2,000 years later. Well, what was Jesus' message? You also ought to wash one another's feet. Believers in Jesus should serve one another. This is the opposite of most popular ideas about leadership, both then and now. But this is the way Jesus lived, and the way he wants us to live too. Another thing that's necessary in the desert is some kind of a head covering. The sun can be very hot, and through much of the year there are few clouds in the sky. Now, this is not just to protect you from getting a sunburn. The ultraviolet radiation can give you a headache or even cause you to pass out. That's why the Bedouin people who live in the desert wear black clothes all the time. It cuts the ultraviolet radiation. All you need to protect yourself is a simple piece of cloth over your head, like those still worn in the deserts of the Middle East today. You can just take a square piece of cloth, fold it into a triangle, and then wrap it around your head. There are many different ways of doing this. In the desert, each tribal group has its own distinctive way. In Arabic, this kind of a head covering is called a keffiyeh. Today, of course, religious Jews wear Western-style hats instead. Another thing that people don't realize about the desert is not only is it hot, but it can also be cold in the desert. You need something more to wear than just a tunic. And in Jesus' day, they wore a talit, a cloak or mantle. The talit was made of a single square piece of cloth like this. It could be worn in many different ways. Sometimes it was worn simply over the shoulders like this. In the law of Moses, God gave special instructions for making the cloak. It was to have a tassel, a tzitzit, at each corner. As it says in Numbers chapter 15, verse 38 to 39, "Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them that they will make for themselves a tassel, a tzitzit, on the corners, or literally the wings, of their garments throughout their generations. And they will put on the tassel of each corner a cord of blue." Now that's in Hebrew, techelet. It means a bluish or purple color. "And it will serve as a tassel for you, and you will see it, and you will remember all the commandments of the Lord." These are the same tassels that Jesus mentioned when he criticized the Pharisees. "But they do all their works to be seen by men, for they lengthen their tassels." But why would God take such an interest in the decoration of their clothing? As it turns out, tassels had an important meaning in the cultures around Israel at the time of Moses. This meaning was lost until some recent archaeological discoveries at Mari in Syria. Here the royal archives of a palace were discovered with some 20,000 clay tablets from the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Mari tablets tell us that in the time of Moses, tassels on a person's clothes were the sign of a high position in society. Only the priests and the rich had tassels. The poor did not, nor did the slaves. But God commanded that every Israelite was to wear tassels. Why? In this way, God showed that every one of His people was important, not just some of them. But why a cord of blue? The dye for the color blue or purple was especially valuable. Today, with synthetic dyes, we can make any color. But in those days, it was very difficult to make a bluish-purple color that would stay in the fabric. You could use berries or certain minerals, but they would wash out quickly. About the only way to make a blue color that would stay in the cloth was from a snail that lives in the Mediterranean Sea. Fishermen would lower baited wicker baskets down into the water and bring up the snails. Then they broke open the shells and brought out a tiny little bit of the dye. It took tens of thousands of snails to make enough dye for a piece of clothing. This meant it was very expensive. As a result, it could only be afforded by kings, a sign of royalty. Remember when they dressed Jesus in a purple robe to make him look like a king? This was to make the false charge against him more believable, that he was plotting a rebellion to make himself king. As it says in Mark chapter 15, verse 17, "And they clothed him in purple and began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!'" Or what about Lydia, whom Paul met in the book of Acts? She was a seller of purple cloth. This means she was a wealthy merchant whose clientele were princes and kings. Back in the time of Moses, This same bluish or purple color was used in many of the curtains of the tabernacle as a symbol of God's royal authority. But he didn't keep this color just for himself. The cord of blue and the tassels of every Israelite was a reminder of their connection with the tabernacle and with the God who dwelled there. Here too was the constant reminder that they were not ordinary people, but they were God's own special possession among the peoples, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Today the tassels worn by the Jewish people are all tied with the same pattern of loops and knots. But in ancient times, each person's tassels were tied differently. And by looking at the tassel, you could tell immediately who it belonged to. You'd recognize the pattern of loops and knots. The Mari tablets mention a prophecy sent to a king by a pagan prophet who included a lock of his hair and a piece of his tassel to prove his identity. Well, this information helps us understand much more clearly many strange events in the Bible. For example, do you remember when God told Elijah to anoint Elisha as a prophet? It's in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 19 to 20. And Elijah went over to Elisha, and he threw his cloak to him. And Elijah left his oxen and ran after Elijah, and he said, "Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and I will follow you." Now, we usually picture Elijah just gently draping his cloth over Elisha, but in Hebrew it actually says that he threw it to him. And then he must have turned around and taken off in the other direction because Elisha had to run to catch up with him. In all of this, notice that Elijah didn't say anything to him. But Elisha knew exactly the meaning of this action. Elijah's cloak represented his personal identity and his prophetic authority. When he threw it to Elisha, and Elisha caught it or perhaps picked it up, it meant that he accepted God's calling to follow Elijah. Or what about the time that King Saul with 3,000 men was chasing David in the desert? There's no place in the desert for any privacy, so Saul used a cave for a restroom. He didn't know that David and his men were hiding inside that same cave. And David's men said to him, "Now's your opportunity to kill your enemy." But remember David's response? He said, "Never will I touch the Lord's anointed." But he did do one thing. He snuck up and he cut off the corner of the garment. Well, when Saul came out, he had no idea of what happened, and he simply picked up his garment and went on out. But after he'd gone out for a couple of moments, David came and looked out the entrance to the cave, and he looked and called out to Saul and said, "Saul, look, see what I have in my hand. I was this close to you. I could have killed you, but I didn't. I'm not your enemy." Do you remember what Saul said back? "Now I know that you will become king." Well, why did he say that? Because he saw David holding the symbol of kingly authority in his hand. And he realized it wouldn't be much longer before he had all the rest. As it says in 1 Samuel 24, verse 20, "And now look, I know that you will surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will rise up in your hand." The tassel held up in David's hand was a symbol that Israel would grow strong under his rule. What about the cloaks that people put under the feet of the donkey that Jesus was riding on Palm Sunday? Why did they do that? To keep the donkey's feet from getting dirty? I don't think so. No, this was a symbol of the people submitting themselves to Jesus' authority as King Messiah. Do you remember the woman who had the flow of blood, who tried to touch the tassel of Jesus' garment? Her story is really a very sad one. Because of that blood, she was what the Jews called zava. This meant that she was in a state of ritual uncleanness. Someone who is zava makes anything unclean she touches, or that she lies on or sits on. And then let's say she sat on a chair. Anyone else who sits there or touches it also becomes unclean. Well, if that happened to you, this meant that you had to take a ritual bath and you would remain unclean until evening. This was a real inconvenience. Who would want to come visit you very often if they knew that they would become unclean? Now, all women went through a similar condition for a few days each month, but she had been unclean for 12 years. That's why she spent all she had on what is usually translated doctors. But of course, these were not like the doctors we have today. They were more like native healers or witch doctors. For example, they would take you to their temple and make you walk in a long, dark tunnel deep underground. But unknown to you, there were openings in the roof of that tunnel. And when they heard you walking underneath, suddenly they would pour water on your head. I guess that's what they call shock therapy, isn't it? Or they might put you in a room filled with snakes. I don't see how that would help you. She wasted all of her money on these things, and it didn't help. But then she heard about the ministry of Jesus, and she got the idea to secretly sneak up and touch the tassel of his cloak. Why would she want to touch his tassel? Because there was a tradition among the Jews that when Messiah came, the wings or corners of his talit, his outer garment, would have healing power. Where did they get that idea? From Malachi chapter 4, verse 2, where it says, "The Son of Righteousness will rise up, and healing will be in his wings, in his corners." The wings or corners were a symbol of his identity and his authority. Her belief that she would be healed by touching Jesus' tassel was a belief that Jesus is the Messiah. There was only one problem with her plan. At that time, he was always surrounded by crowds. If she tried to get close to him, she would have to press up against many people in the crowd, making them unclean. Doing such a thing was socially unacceptable. No nice person would even think of doing such a thing. But she was desperate. Her condition had so humiliated her and ruined her life that she was willing to do something that was socially unacceptable because she believed that if only she could touch the tassel of his cloak, she would be healed. Well, do you remember what happened? In spite of the huge crowd pressing against Jesus, he noticed that something had happened. And he began to say, "Who touched me?" Well, just imagine the situation of this woman. She thought she could carry out her plan secretly. But now Jesus was looking for her. How embarrassing. And if he found her, what she did would be exposed to the crowd, and she thought everyone would despise her. That's why when she finally did confess, she came trembling and fell down before Jesus. The last thing in the world she expected to hear were the kind words of Jesus, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Some translations say, "Your faith has made you well." But in Greek it clearly says, "Your faith has saved you." Her faith that Jesus' tassels were the wings, the corners of the Messiah, had not only brought her physical healing, but brought her into a saving relationship with God. The rabbis even today talk of coming to God as coming under his wings. This is based on that beautiful verse from the book of Ruth when Boaz blesses Ruth for accepting Israel and Israel's God, saying, "May the Lord reward what you have done, and may your wages be peaceful from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Those who come in faith to Jesus come under the wings of the Almighty. As David said, "With his feathers he will cover you, and under his wings you will seek refuge." What a beautiful picture this is of those who come with faith to Jesus. As with the woman, he accepts us while we are still unclean. He heals us, and he sends us out with a blessing. Today we can, of course, no longer touch the actual tassels of Jesus' cloak, but we can do something similar to contact his identity and his authority. What is that? To pray in Jesus' name. Just like the tassels of ancient times, the name of Jesus, Yeshua, represents the identity and the authority of the Messiah. And there is healing in his wings.